Gaza officials say Israeli airstrikes on a center for displaced people have killed dozens near the city of Rafah. But the Israeli army says it had been targeting Hamas militants. The health ministry in the Hamas-run territory says the strikes injured dozens of people, most of them women and children. Fighting has recently centered on Rafah, where Israel's military launched a ground operation earlier this month, despite widespread opposition over concerns for civilians sheltering there. Well, let's stay with the conflict. Amnesty International has urged the ICC to investigate war crimes on 3 recent Israeli strikes that killed 44 Palestinian civilians, including 32 children. It comes just days after its prosecutor, Karim Khan, applied for arrest warrants against Israeli and Hamas leaders on suspicion of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Amnesty International says 3 Israeli airstrikes, which took place last month, are further evidence of a broader pattern of war crimes committed by the Israeli military in Gaza. All right, let's take a look at the impact of the strike on Rafah. We're joined this afternoon by Nebal Farsakh, spokesperson for the Palestinian Red Crescent Society, or the Palestine Red Crescent Society. Nebal, thanks very much indeed for coming on, and you're joining us from Ramallah this afternoon. And of course, it is an excuse we've heard several times from the IDF, isn't it, that they were targeting Hamas militants in areas that just happened to be occupied by civilians who are trying to shelter from the war in Gaza?
Good evening, Michelle. Thanks for having me. It is because it's not the first time we have seen civilians being targeted everywhere in Gaza Strip. Yesterday, it was a very heartbreaking night. Our teams responded to the attack of shelling of civilian tents northwest of Rafah in an area that was designated as a safe zone for displaced civilians. Families were preparing to go to sleep at a time when the shelling began. Tents caught fire. People, including children, got stuck inside the fire, which has resulted to critical injuries as well as serious burns. Our teams transported the casualties to field hospitals in Rafah. Since there is no hospital that is still operational and can address all of these number of casualties, we are still concerned that many of those who are critically wounded might lose their lives since they don't have the needed care, medical care in hospitals, and there is no way to evacuate them out of Gaza Strip because the Rafah crossing, which is the only way to get in or out of Gaza Strip, is remain closed. We continue to call on the international community to apply pressure on Israel, to hold Israel accountable, to take serious steps to ensure protection for civilians under international humanitarian law. What is going on is unimaginable, is unacceptable. We have seen civilians, including children, being burned while they were just trying to sleep inside their tents. When attack happened, the attack targeted an area which is crowded because there's tens of thousands of people. They were taking shelter there, living in tents. After they were forced to flee over and over again, they thought they will be in a safe, especially that the area was claimed as a safe zone. Despite the very hard displacement journey, at the end, they just faced this horrific end, being targeted at night time while they were trying to prepare themselves for bed.
And of course, Nebal, this latest firing on Gaza, I would say, just a little over 48 hours since the ICJ's order on Friday that Israel stop its offensive on Rafah.
It is absolutely disappointed. We have seen the ICJ resolution, many UN resolution, still Israel is still committed more war crimes, is still targeting civilians, still targeting humanitarians and healthcare personnel. This will continue to happen if the international community will not take serious action. We need more serious action to hold Israel accountable, to ensure the protection of civilians, because, as I said, this is not new. We have seen repeated attacks on civilians since the beginning of the war on Gaza. More than 70% of the victims of those thousands who have been killed are from children and women, and yet this is still allowed to happen every single day. The targeting last night, it was an area that was designated as a safe zone. This has come again to prove that in Gaza there is no safe place. Civilians being targeted in schools, UNRWA schools, hospitals, mosques, everywhere. In Gaza, there is no safe place or a protected person.
I would ask you this question, Nebal, and I would understand as the Palestine Red Crescent Society whether you want to answer, but do you believe as the society that Israel has ever been targeting Hamas when it's been firing on the Gaza Strip?
As an emergency medical service provider, we have dealt with many attacks on civilians, homes, infrastructures, hospitals, where the victims were truly innocent civilians, children and women, and in many cases, humanitarians, doctors, nurses, and paramedics as well. Since the beginning of the war on Gaza, Israel has been systematically targeting civilians, humanitarians, and healthcare personnel. We have lost 17 PRCS members. All of them were killed while they were on duty trying to save people's life. There is no justification or whatsoever for this repeated attacks on civilians and the humanitarians. Every single time there's such an attack, we hear such stories of Israel targeting fighters or whatsoever. This is not true. The numbers of those who have been targeted and killed since the beginning of the war are a great proof. More than 15,000 children were killed since the beginning of the war on Gaza, in addition to the increasing number of targeting humanitarians and healthcare personnel. This should be stopped as the international humanitarian law is crystal clear. Humanitarians and civilians should be respected and protected.
And yet that was a completely different story that Israel and its lawyers told the ICJ. Before the decision by the ICJ on Friday, South Africa approached the court again to ask for more measures, more provisional measures in specifically Rafah. And Israel and its lawyers made a case before the court that it was going above and beyond to ensure that humanitarian aid was flowing into Gaza, specifically through the Rafah crossing, that hundreds of trucks were going in every day, and that every effort was being made to address the humanitarian tragedy that's unfolding in Gaza. Was that a lie, Nebal, according to what you know on the ground?
Unfortunately, despite how important this resolution is, as we have seen from what happens every day on the ground, the situation is only getting worse. This attack has happened right after this resolution have been taken. Israel is still violating the international humanitarian law and all the resolutions that came in with no respect for the international resolutions or the international humanitarian law. We still seeing the situation is getting worse and worse every single day. There is continuous and relentless bombardments. There is decreasing in the number of aid trucks that are allowed to get into Gaza. The Rafah border crossing is still closed for more than 3 weeks, and every single day the situation is getting worse to the extent that we have lost we have passed literally any kind of description. If I say catastrophe, dire disaster, or whatsoever, these are not working anymore. There are no words.
Yeah, absolutely. So what now for aid workers in Rafah? Does your organization, for example, have adequate supplies or any supplies at all to deal with this latest tragedy with these shellings on Rafah?
To be clear, the healthcare system is almost in a collapse status. Most hospitals were taken out of service. So now only few hospitals are still operating. All of them suffer from extreme shortages of medications, medical supplies, as well as fuel, which is needed for the power generators. Those few hospitals who are left are already exceeded their capacities, where you can see people wounded, bleeding on the ground of hospitals waiting to be treated. The situation as for the healthcare system, just disasters. It's the same for the emergency medical service provider. We absolutely lack equipment, medical supplies, as well as medications. However, despite how dangerous the situation, despite the repeated attacks on our teams are still doing their best to continue to provide their life-saving services to the people and alleviate their suffering, despite themselves are also enduring unimaginable situations where their families as well suffer because of the lack of food and the clean water and even shelter. They still selflessly trying their best around the clock to save as much people as they can.
Nebal Farsakh, thank you for your time this afternoon. Spokesperson for the Palestine Red Crescent Society, joining us live from Ramallah this afternoon. She says she's run out of adjectives to describe the disaster, the catastrophe, the absolute tragedy unfolding in Gaza. Israel, for its part, calling the World Court, the ICJ's order on Friday, outrageous and morally repugnant and disgusting, says accusations that it is committing genocide in Gaza are quote-unquote false. Even with this latest strike on Rafah, Israel says it was targeting Hamas militants.